Hello dear students, welcome all of you to today's logic class. Today we will discuss about the special syllogistic rule of 4 different figures. चारोटी संस्थानर स्वतंत्र नियमावली विषय आज आम आलोचना करिबा. Before going to discuss about the 4 different before going to discuss about the special syllogistic rule of 4 different figures, we must know that in this book there are 3 different tests are given in order to test the validity of argument. In syllogism, the 10 general syllogistic rules, second one is special syllogistic rules of 4 different figures, and third one is Aristotle dictum and reduction. 10टी साधारण नियमावली एवं 4टी संस्थानर स्वतंत्र नियमावली एवं आरिस्टोटलଙ୍କର मौलिक सूत्र एवं रूपांतरीकरण. Through these 3 different methods we can test the validity of an argument. So here in this unit we have discussed the special syllogistic rule of 4 different figures. But in today's class we will discuss the special syllogistic rule of figure 1 and figure 2. प्रथम एवं द्वितीय संस्थानर स्वतंत्र नियमावली विषय आमे आलोचना करिबा एवं ताहार प्रमाण मध्य करिबा. So before going to prove the special syllogistic rules of first and second figure, we just remember 3 different things, 3 important things, and out of the 3 important things, the first one is we remember the 10 general syllogistic rules of syllogism. त्रिपदी जुक्तिर 10टी साधारण नियमावली आमको मन रखिया पड़िबो एवं द्वितीय कथा हला which proposition distributes which terms. That means केउ तर्क वाक्य काहाकू को पद को व्याप्त करे. Because in order to prove the special syllogistic rule of figure 1 and 2 or 4 different figures, we take the help of the general syllogistic rules. By taking the help of 10 general syllogistic rules, we can prove the 4 different figures special syllogistic rule. तो साधारण नियमावलीर आवश्यकता हमर एथि पड़ुछि जे काहेकि ना एठारे आमे स्वतंत्र नियमावली को प्रूफ करिया पाई प्रमाण करिया पाई आमे 10टी जनरल बा साधारण नियमावली सहायरे आमे एहा को प्रमाण करिबा. So we must remember 10 general syllogistic rules. And here I must say one thing that which proposition distributes which term. So according to quality and quantity there are 4 different propositions. So we have universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative and particular negative. तो हमको mixed principle अनुसार there are 4 different propositions. According to the distribution of term, the first universal affirmative proposition distributes the subject, or we can say that it universal affirmative distributes subject term, and universal negative, that is E proposition, symbolically it is represented as E proposition, it distributes both subject and predicate. दीटा जाक को distribute करे. And third I proposition, which is called particular affirmative, it distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate. काहा को भी distribute करे नहीं. O proposition that distributes only predicate and not the subject. So you have to remember the distribution of term, the which proposition distributes which term. तो those who जो माने को ओडिया रे पढुचंदी से माने जानिबा दरकार जे ए प्रपोजिशन रो ओडिया रे हम कहूचे आ तर्क वाक्य, ई प्रपोजिशन को हम कहूचे ए तर्क वाक्य, आई प्रपोजिशन को हम कहूचे ई तर्क वाक्य एवं ओ प्रपोजिशन को हम कहूचे ओ तर्क वाक्य. ताले सब्जेक्ट कहले उद्देश्य पद, प्रेडिकेट कहले विधेय पद. सो ए प्रपोजिशन बा आ तर्क वाक्य केवल उद्देश्य को व्याप्त करे ए तर्क वाक्य आम ओडिया रे कहूचे ए तर्क वाक्य उभय उद्देश्य एवं विधेय को व्याप्त करे। ई तर्क वाक्य उभय सॉरी ई तर्क वाक्य नाइदर द सब्जेक्ट नॉर द प्रेडिकेट उद्देश्य बा विधेय कहा भी व्याप्त करे नहीं कि ओ तर्क वाक्य केवल विधेय पद को व्याप्त करे सब्जेक्ट बा उद्देश्य को व्याप्त करे नहीं। सो यू मस्ट रिमेंबर these 4 things, that means which proposition distributes which term, because when we prove the special syllogistic rules we must know which term is distributed in which premises or conclusion, because if a term is not distributed in the according to the 10 general syllogistic rules, if a term is not distributed in the premise but it is distributed in the conclusion, then the fallacy arises, so that we can prove the argument is invalid. So in order to prove the special syllogistic rules, we take the help of 10 general syllogistic rules and the distribution of terms. And another important thing is, when you prove the special syllogistic rule of different figures, you must remember, you must know the diagram of the figure, because the figure of the syllogism is determined by the position of middle term. So you must know the middle term, the predicate, the major term, the minor term is situated in which place. So these 3 things are necessary in order to prove the special syllogistic rules. ताले दुईटी संस्थान आमे जो एबे स्वतंत्र नियमावली आमे प्रमाण करिबा, सेथिपे आमे साधारण नियमावली एवं को प्रपोजिशन बा को तर्क वाक्य काहाकू डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करे एवं सेही संस्थान रो फिगर को आमे जानिबा दरकार. So now let us prove the special syllogistic rule of figure 1. So प्रथमे आमे प्रथम संस्थान रो स्वतंत्र नियमावली को प्रमाण करिबा. So now let us start. So before proving it, before going to prove the special syllogistic rules of first figure, I just read out what are the special rules of first figure. So first there are 2 special syllogistic rules of figure 1, and first one is the major premise must be universal. ताले प्रथम संस्थान रे से कहूची मेजर प्रेमिस जोड़ा कमे साध्यावयव कहूचे, साध्यावयव निश्चित भाव रे यूनिवर्सल, दैट इज सार्विक, साध्यावयव निश्चित भाव रे सार्विक हेबो. एवं the second rule is the minor premise must be affirmative. एवं पक्षावयव कौन हम, पक्षावयव आमर सदर्थक हम. The minor premise must be affirmative. So we first prove the first special syllogistic rule of figure 1. प्रथम आमे प्रथम संस्थान रो प्रथम संस्थान आमे प्रथम नियम को प्रमाण करिबा. So first, so you just see the diagram of or the figure of first figure. The first figure ro middle term is situated in the subject place of major premise and in the predicate place of minor premise. So this is the first figure, and the rule states that, the first rule states that the major premise must be universal. So here when we are going to prove it, first let it be that the major premise is not universal. If the major premise is not universal, then it will be particular. So first the major premise is not universal, let it be particular. So in figure 1 or in first figure, the position of middle term is in the subject place of major premise. If the major premise is not universal, then let it be particular. If it is a particular proposition, so a particular proposition kale either I or O. Tale particular proposition either particular affirmative or it is particular negative. Tale eta E habo kimba O habo. ताले particular propositions we know in distribution of term I said that the particular propositions distributes only predicate. There is the possibility of distribution of a predicate term in case of particular proposition, because I proposition distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate, and O proposition distributes only predicate. So, there is the possibility of distribution of predicate term. So, here in major premise the position of middle term is in the subject class. In the एठी मेजर मिडिल टर्म जहाँ मध्य पद यह उद्देश्य जगार अच्छी, उद्देश्य स्थान रे अच्छी, किंतु ई एवं ओ तर्क वाक्य उद्देश्य को डिस्ट्रीब्यूट बा व्याप्त करे नहीं, यह विधेय को व्याप्त करियार संभावना अच्छी, बिकॉज ओ प्रपोजिशन डिस्ट्रीब्यूट्स ओनली प्रेडिकेट. So, here the middle term is not distributed in the major premise, but according to the general syllogistic rule 3, rule 3 अनुसारे आमे देखुचे जे if the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. जे कोनोसी दीटा तर्क वाक्य हेतु वाक्य मध्यरु जे कोनोसी गोटिए हेतु वाक्य रे मिडिल टर्म बा जहा को मध्य पद कहूचे थरे मात्र व्याप्त हेबा दरकार. If the middle term is not distributed in the major or minor premise, then we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. अव्याप्त मध्य पद दोष सृष्टि हब. So, in order to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle, we try to distribute the middle term in the minor premise. ताहले एठी आमे मिडिल टर्म बा मध्य पद को आमे एठी माइनर प्रेमिस रे डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करिया को चेष्टा करिबा, बिकॉज so that we can avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. In order to distribute the middle term or the madhya pada in the minor premise, what do we do? Now, we know that the negative propositions distribute their predicate. The negative proposition तार कहा को distribute करे predicate term को. Here, in order to distribute the middle term in the minor premise, the minor premise must be a negative proposition, so that the middle term can be distributed. Here it is proved that the major premise is a. First we take major premise as particular. It cannot, if it is not universal, then it is particular. The particular, and here we say that in order to distribute the middle term in the predicate place, the minor premise must be a negative proposition. Because negative proposition kale we understand either E or O. So, both E and O proposition distribute their predicate. So, if it is a negative proposition, then the middle term can be distributed in the minor premise and we can avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, if the major premise is particular, then the middle term which takes the position of jadi minor premise middle negative hover, then the negative proposition distributes its predicate and we can avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. But the rule number 5 states that both the propositions cannot be negative, because from two negative proposition we cannot draw any conclusion. No conclusion can be drawn from two negative propositions. ताले दीटा negative जदि premise रुहे ताले कोनोसी conclusion draw हेई परिबनी. So, in order to so according to the rule number 6, one of the premise according to the rule number 5, one negative and another is affirmative. So, here we prove that the major premise is first truth particular and here it is affirmative, because both the premises cannot be negative at the same time. And according to rule number general syllogistic rule 6, if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So, here we get negative conclusion. So, minor premise negative, major premise affirmative and particular, and the conclusion is negative. If the conclusion is a negative proposition, then it will distribute its predicate term. ताले यह को विधेय पद को व्याप्त करिवो ताले if the predicate term and the predicate term is otherwise known as the major term because the conclusion of the predicate of the conclusion is called the major term. So, here in conclusion the major term is distributed. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it should be distributed in the major premise. Why? Now, because the rule number 4 states that if no term can be distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the premise. Suppose if the major term is distributed in the major in the conclusion, but not distributed in the major premise, then we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. अवैध साध्यता दोष सृष्टि होब. सेमती if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the minor premise, then we will also commit the fallacy of illicit minor. Therefore, in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit measure, the major term should be distributed in the major premise. ताले major term जेहेतु conclusion बा सिद्धांत रे व्याप्त हेइछि तेणुक आमे चाहिबा जेमति कि मेजर टर्म मेजर प्रेमिस रे डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हो. सो हियर इन ऑर्डर टू डिस्ट्रीब्यूट द मेजर टर्म व्हाट डू वी डू the major term is present in the predicate place in the major premise. ताले एटी विधेय जगह रे कि अछि major term, but already we have proved that the major premise is an affirmative and particular proposition. ताले major premise टा गोटे affirmative आउ particular proposition. तो affirmative particular किए ना I proposition. But we know that I proposition distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate. काहाकु भी distribute करेनी. So here the major term is distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the major premise. ताले एटी major premise distribute हेनी किंतु conclusion distribute होउची. So we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. So if we take the whatever we suppose that the major premise is not a universal proposition, rather it is a particular proposition. If we suppose it, then it will lead to the fallacy of illicit measure. ताले अवैध साध्यता दोष सृष्टि हब. So it is proved that the major premise cannot be a particular proposition, rather it must be a universal proposition. So here it is proved. So then the second general rule. Now we prove the second special syllogistic rule of first figure. So what is the second special syllogistic rule? The minor premise must be affirmative. से कहूची जे हेतु वाक्य भितरु जोटा पक्षावयव ओडिया रे पक्षावयव बोली कहूची पक्षावयव निश्चित भाव में कौन हम ना सदर्थक हम नंजर्थक हेनी. The minor premise must be affirmative, it cannot be negative. So in order to prove it, let it be that the minor premise is not affirmative, rather let it be negative. ताले आमे याकू कहबा जे मने करे एटा सदर्थक हबनी एहा नंजर्थक हब. ताले if the minor premise is not affirmative, then let it be negative. जदि एहा सदर्थक न हुए ताहले एहा नंजर्थक हब. If the minor premise is negative, then the major premise must be affirmative. So the second special syllogistic rule is the minor premise must be affirmative. Let it be that the minor premise is not negative, rather it is if the minor premise is not affirmative, then let it be negative. If it is a negative proposition, the minor premise is negative proposition, then the minor negative कहले either E or O. Here the negative proposition, according to the rule number 5, general syllogistic rule number 5, both the premises cannot be negative, because from two negative premises we cannot draw any conclusion. So, here if the minor premise is negative, then the major premise must be affirmative. According to the rule number 6, if the major premise is affirmative and the minor premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative, because if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So, here if the conclusion is a negative proposition, either E or O, then the predicate term, that is otherwise known as major term, is distributed in the conclusion. So, negative conclusion distributes its predicate विधेय पद को व्याप्त करुछि. So, that major term should be distributed in the major premise, because the rule number 4 states that no term can be distributed in the conclusion without being distributed in the premises. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the major premise, then we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. So, in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit measure, the major term should be distributed in the major premise. But before, we have already proved that the major premise is an affirmative proposition, because both the propositions both the premises cannot be negative. So, we take one of them as affirmative. So, here it is proved that the major premise is an affirmative proposition. So, affirmative proposition is either A or I. ताले ए दुईटा तर्क वाक्य को आम affirmative आ बा ई proposition को आम कहूचे. So, affirmative propositions do not distribute their predicate, because I proposition distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate, and A proposition distributes only subject. So, here the predicate of the conclusion, which is otherwise known as the major term, is distributed in the conclusion, but not distributed in the major premise. So, that we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure here. ताले एठी आमे जदि मेजर टर्म को आमे देखुचे बा जोटा को आमे कहूचे कोन मेजर टर्म इज अदरवाइज कॉल्ड major term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the major premise. So, if we take the minor premise as a negative proposition, जदि आमे minor premise को गोटे नंजर्थक तर्क वाक्य भाव में नौचे, then we will commit the fallacy of illicit measure or अवैध साध्यता दोष. So, the supposition, whatever we assume that the minor premise can be a negative proposition, is proved to be wrong. So, the minor premise of the first figure must be an affirmative proposition. So, here it is proved that the major premise of first figure is a universal proposition and the minor premise is an affirmative proposition. So, here we prove it. If the now we will apply the two special syllogistic rules of first figure in order to test the validity of the argument in first figure, or here we will find out what are the valid moods in first figure by the application of the special syllogistic rule of first figure. So, we know that the two special syllogistic rules, the universal premise, the major premise is a universal proposition and the minor premise is an affirmative proposition. So, here we have 8 possible combinations. So, there are 16 possible combinations, but by the application of general syllogistic rules, 8 are rejected and now we will have only 8 possible combinations, and out of the 8 possible combinations we will find out which of them are valid according to the special syllogistic rule of first figure. So, we have these 8 possible combinations AA, AE, AI, AO and EI, EI, EA, I, A and I, O. So, out of these 8 possible combinations, we will apply the 2 special syllogistic rules of first figure. So, if we apply the first syllogistic rule, then IA and OA, IA and OA will be rejected. Why? Now, because the first rule states that the major premise must be universal, but here the IA, OA. Here the major premise is particular in both cases, particular affirmative and particular negative. So, here the major premise is not a universal proposition. So, these two are rejected according to the first rule. According to the second rule, AE and AO, AE and AO are rejected, because here the second rule states that the minor premise must be affirmative. So, here the minor premise is a negative proposition and here minor premise is also a negative proposition. This is universal negative and this is particular negative. So, these two are also rejected. So, if we apply the 2 special syllogistic rules in case of these 8 possible combinations, then we will reject these 4 possible combinations and the rest 4 are valid in case of first figure, and we give the name to these 4 possible combinations. From AA we get Barbara, A from Barbara, AI we get Darii, Darii, EI, EI ru am pauche Ferio, Ferio, and from EA we get Celarent. So, Barbara, Darii, Celarent and Ferio, these 4 valid modes are in first figure. So, we have 4 valid modes according to the special syllogistic rules. Now, let us prove the special syllogistic rule of second figure. So, the first rule of second figure, first special syllogistic rule of second figure is the major premise must be universal. Here you must remember, you must know what is the diagram or figure of second figure. द्वितीय संस्थान diagram केमती आमे मन रखिया. Then we will prove the rules of second figure. The rule 1 is the major premise must be universal, and we draw the figure. In second figure, the position of middle term is in subject place in both the premises. दुईटी जाक हेतु वाक्य मध्यम पदर स्थान विधेय जगार एवं major term is in the subject place and minor term is also in the subject place. So, the major premise must be universal. Suppose we suppose that if the major premise is not universal, then let it be particular. जदि universal सार्विक न हुए ताहले यह आंशिक हेबो particular. If the major premise is a particular proposition, then what will happen? Now, particular proposition is either it may be I proposition or it may be O proposition. So, if the major premise is a particular proposition, then the major term will not be distributed in the major premise. Why? Because I proposition distributes nothing, neither the subject nor the predicate, and O proposition distributes only predicate, केवल predicate को distribute करिबो. So, there is no possibility of distribution of subject term, and in subject place the major term is present. So, here in major premise the major term is not distributed. So, if the term is not distributed in the major premise, it should not be distributed in the conclusion, because according to the rule number 4, general syllogistic rule number 4, the term which is not distributed in the premise should not be distributed in the conclusion. ताले जो पद से तर्क वाक्य बा हेतु वाक्य व्याप्त न होइछि ताहा सिद्धांत रे मध्य व्याप्त हेबा उचित नुहे. So, in order to avoid the fallacy of illicit measure, ताले जदि आमे मेजर टर्म को सिद्धांत रे अनडिस्ट्रीब्यूट करबा को चाहूचे, in order to make it remain undistributed in the conclusion must be an affirmative proposition. Why? Now, because affirmative proposition is either a or I proposition, universal affirmative or particular affirmative. In order to make the major term undistributed in the conclusion, if the conclusion will be an affirmative proposition, then the predicate of the conclusion remains undistributed, because the affirmative propositions do not distribute their predicate, rather there is the possibility of distribution of the subject term. So, here the conclusion is an affirmative proposition. According to the rule number 7, general syllogistic rule number 7, if the conclusion is affirmative, it necessitates that both the premises must be affirmative. Rule 7 states that if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion is affirmative and vice versa. Conclusion जदि affirmative हुए सदर्थक हुए ताहले major और minor दीटा जाक premise कौन हबो affirmative बा सदर्थक हबो. So, here from this we know that the major premise is affirmative and the minor premise is also affirmative. So, here both the premises are affirmative, so that the conclusion can be affirmative. But in figure 2, second figure, the place of middle term is in the predicate place in both the premises. दुईटे जाक हेतु वाक्य रे मध्यम पद को जगह रे अछि, मध्य पद विधेय जगह रे अछि. But affirmative propositions do not distribute their predicate. Here we see the affirmative propositions do not distribute their predicate, rather there is the possibility of distribution of the subject term. So, here as middle term is present in both the premises in the predicate place, here the fallacy of undistributed middle will arise. So, if we suppose that the major premise must be particular, then we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, the major premise cannot be a particular proposition, rather it must be universal. ताले particular हेई परिबा नै, universal आंशिक हेई परिबा नै, यह निश्चित भाबरे सार्विक हेबो. So, this is the rule 1 or special syllogistic rule 1 of second figure. Now, we will prove the second special syllogistic rule of second figure. Second figure रो आमे द्वितीय स्वतंत्र नियमावली को प्रमाण करिबा. So, the second rule is, the second special syllogistic rule is, one of the premises must be negative. So, now we will prove it. If one of the premises be not negative, जदि दुईटे जाक हेतु वाक्य रु गोटे भी नेगेटिव बा नंजर्थक न हुए, then both are affirmative or both are negative. दुईटे जाक नंजर्थक हबो बा दुईटे जाक सदर्थक हबो. If both the premises are negative, then we cannot draw any conclusion, because according to the rule number 5, general syllogistic rule number 5, from two negative conclusion, from two negative premises we cannot draw any conclusion. So, both the premises cannot be negative, and if one of the premise is not negative, then there is the possibility that both the premises, or we let it be that both the premises are affirmative. If both the premises are affirmative, if both the premises are affirmative, here it is already proved in the first rule, then the middle term which is situated in the predicate place in both the premises, दीटा जाक हेतु वाक्य रे मध्यम पद विधेय जगार उपस्थित। जदि दुईटा जाक हेतु वाक्य सदर्थक हुए, अफर्मेटिव हुए, देन आइदर ए और आई, ओडिया रे कहले आमे आ किंबा ई तर्क वाक्य हबो। If both the premises are affirmative, then the middle term cannot be distributed, because affirmative propositions do not distribute their predicate, rather they distribute the subject. So, the rule number 3 states that if rule number 3, general syllogistic rule number 3 states that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. जेमिति हेले थरे मात्र जे कोनोसी हेतु वाक्य रे व्याप्त हेबा उचित। But here it is proved that as both the premises are affirmative proposition, the middle term is not distributed here. So, we will commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. ताले एठी हमें undistributed middle बा अव्याप्त मध्य पद दोष सृष्टि हबार संभावना अछि। So, in order to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle, we cannot say that both the premises are affirmative or negative. So, it is proved that one of the premise must be negative in second figure. So, now it is proved. Now, let us apply these two rules in case of, now we will apply these two special syllogistic rules in order to determine the valid moods in figure 2. Figure 2 रे हमें ए दीटा रूल को अप्लाई करिकी So, what are the possible combinations? Out of the 16 possible combinations, 8 are rejected according to the general syllogistic rule 10. तो 10टा general rule को ये करी हमें 8टा possible combination को reject करिचे. So, what are the other 8 possible combinations in which we can apply these two rules and find out or determine the valid moods of second figure? So, what are the 8 possible combinations? AA, AE, AI, AO and EI, AE, AO, So, these are the 8 possible combinations in which we apply the two special syllogistic rules of second figure. So, if we apply the first rule, that is the major premise must be universal. Here if we apply the major premise must be universal, these two are rejected, because here the major premise is not universal, rather it is particular. So, IA and IOA are rejected here. Now, if we apply the second rule, one of the premises must be negative. So, here one of the premises negative, these two are rejected, because AA both are affirmative, and in AI both are also affirmative. So, here these two are also rejected. That means, these 4 possible combinations cannot be a valid mode in second figure. So, the rest are valid in case of second figure. So, from A E we get camestress, or in Odia we say samestress, and from A O we get barocco, samestress, and from E I we get festino, and from E A we get celarent, sorry, Cesare. So, these are the 4 different valid modes in second figure: samestress, barocco, festino, and Cesare. Now, we have some questions from these 2 figures. So, here we discussed 4 different special syllogistic rule of first figure and second figure. So, now we will discuss certain questions which are coming from these 2 figures. So, what are the now a question can be, what are the special syllogistic rule of figure 1? The special syllogistic rule कौन है परिवा figure 1 रो? The first rule, the major premise must be universal, and the second rule, the minor premise must be affirmative. Or we can say that प्रथम संस्थान रो 2टी नियम बा 2टी स्वतंत्र नियमावली कौन है परिवा? तो प्रथमटी होची जे what the major premise must be universal and the minor premise must be affirmative. The special syllogistic rule of, what are the special syllogistic rule of second figure? द्वितीय संस्थान स्वतंत्र नियमावली कौन कौन हो पारे? तो the 2 special syllogistic rules of second figure is, the major premise must be universal and one of the premise must be negative. So, now what are the valid modes of figure 1 and figure 2 according to the, or by the application of the special syllogistic rule of first figure? What are the valid modes of first figure? The valid modes of first figure according to the special syllogistic rules is Barbara, Darii, Celarent, and Ferriot. Similarly, what are the valid modes of second figure by the application of special syllogistic rule of second figure? तो द्वितीय संस्थान स्वतंत्र नियमावली अनुसार कौन कौन सब वैध न्याय रूप अटे? तो the 4 valid modes of second figure are samestress, barocco, Cesare, and festino. These are the 4 valid modes of second figure. The major premise must be dash in figure 1. It can be a question, the major premise of figure 1 is dash. The major premise must be universal in figure 1. The minor premise must be dash in figure 1. The minor premise must be affirmative in figure 1. So, from the special syllogistic rule 2, the major premise must be dash in figure 2. Figure 2 रे major premise कौन हवा उचित? The major premise must be universal in figure 2, and one of the premise must be dash in figure 2. The one of the premise must be negative in figure 2. Now, suppose name the valid moods of A in first figure. Name the valid moods of A in first figure. The A represents the major premise, the second vowel represents the minor premise, and the third is a conclusion. So, from A we get Barbara. Similarly, these are the possible questions which we can get from these two different figures. From A, E. Name the valid moods of this combination A, E in second figure. The A, from A, we can get some stress. Similarly, from E रू आमे को पॉसिबल मूड पाइबा वैलिड मूड तो से सारे मेठी we can get sisare in second figure from E. Similarly, from EIO, what is the name of this valid mode? EIO, festino. From AII, which valid mode we get or name the valid mode of first figure? AII, that is Dari E. And what is the valid or what is the valid mode of EAE in EAE in first figure? That is Celarent. So, similarly, we can get the valid moods in first and second figure by the application of the special syllogistic rules. And in first figure or all the valid moods of first figure are called fundamental moods, and all the moods of second figure is also fundamental moods. After the completion of the special syllogistic rule of 4 different figures, I will explain what is fundamental syllogism or fundamental mode, what is strengthened and what is weakened. But you must remember that all the valid modes of first figure and second figure are fundamental valid modes, fundamental syllogism. Then from Barbara we can get a weakened syllogism, that is from Barbara we can get Barbari, but I will explain it after the completion of the third and fourth figure, the special syllogistic rules of third and fourth figure. But you know that from Barbara we get Barbari, from Celarent we can get Celaront, CELARONT, Celaront. Similarly, from Camestros we can get Camestros, STROS. These are the weakened syllogism of first and second figure. From Cesare we can also get Cesaru. So, these are the weakened syllogisms in first and second figure. So, suppose this can be a question also from EI combination. EI combination, what follows as conclusion in figure 1 and figure 2? प्रथम संस्थान और द्वितीय संस्थान रे EI combination रो आमे कौन possible mood पाई परिया? फर्स्ट फिगर भी अच्छी एटा, सेकेंड फिगर भी अच्छी एटा. EI रो आमे कौन पाई परिया ना EI रो आमे O पाई परिया, EIO, but the figure is different. From EI we can get O, but the moods are different. In first figure it will be Ferio, and in second figure from EI we can get O, but the name is different, that is Festino. So, in first figure from EI we can get O, that is Ferio, and in second figure from EI combination we can get O, that is Festino. Similarly, in in first figure and also in second figure, from EA combination we can get we can also get two valid modes. EA रे अच्छी second figure रे EA रू E पाई परिया, from EA we can get A in second figure and that is Cesare, and in first figure from EA we can get Cesare and EA ru we can get in first figure AE, that is Celarent. So, this is possible. The form is same, but as the figure is different, the modes are also different. In second figure EA ru E पाइले आमे Cesare कहूचे, किंतु EA ru E first figure that is Celarent. So, these are the possible valid modes in second figure and first figure. Now, this is all about the special syllogistic rule of figure 1 and figure 2 in syllogism. त्रिपदी जुक्तिर आमे प्रथम एवं द्वितीय संस्थानर समस्त स्वतंत्र नियमावली एठारे आलोचना कले एवं तार प्रमाण मध्य कले, and by applying these special syllogistic rules we also determine the valid modes of first and second figure, and we get 8 valid modes in first and second figure. In first figure we have 4 valid modes and in second figure we have 4 valid modes. So, this is all about the special syllogistic rules of figure 1 and figure 2. Thank you.